Good morning, good afternoon to all distinguished panelists, speakers, and participants who've joined virtually. It's wonderful to be with all of you here today, even though we are virtual. And it is my honor to warmly welcome you to this official ECOSOC Humanitarian Affairs segment side event, which we've titled The Challenges Ahead, Equipping the Future with Anticipatory Action. It's going to be a great event, and we're delighted to have all of you here with us today. My name is Dr. Erin Coughlin de Perez, and I'm an associate professor at Tufts University here in Boston in the United States. And I'm also an advisor with the Red Crescent Climate Center, looking at climate change adaptation around the world. So I'm delighted to moderate this important side event sponsored by the German Federal Foreign Office and the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. It's also been co-organized by the Anticipatory Action Task Force, which is made up by the IFRC, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, START Network, and the World Food Program, and the Anticipation Hub. So on behalf of all these sponsors and co-organizers, I'd like to thank all of our distinguished speakers and highlight the timeliness of this event. So we all know that climate change is one of the biggest problems facing the world today, right? We hear about it all the time, and we hear about the urgency of the climate crisis constantly. Youth are reminding us of this all the time. We're looking at cascading social, economic, and political impacts around the world. And 2050 is a year that we often talk about when we're looking into the future and looking at climate into the future. And we expect to see 200 million people who might need additional humanitarian assistance every year at that point due to climate-related disasters. So in light of all this, the Anticipation Action Task Force has been really looking at how we need to change how we do humanitarian response. We need to invest in anticipatory action instead of waiting and reacting to disasters all the time, but instead start acting ahead of them. We need to protect diverse, vulnerable, and marginalized communities and our finite resources. So we have three goals for today's event. We want to critically reflect on the progress that we've made as a community working on anticipatory action. Second, we want to assess how we can be ready for this mix of climate and humanitarian challenges ahead between now and 2050. And third, we want to explore the way that we can scale up anticipatory action measures for the future. So before we officially begin, I'd like to take you through a few housekeeping measures. First of all, you can notice that we do have closed captioning, which can hopefully help people follow along with what we're saying. Apologies for any mistakes in the closed captioning as it tries to process what we're saying as we say it. And second, we would like to note that this event is recorded. So if you are not comfortable with this, please turn off your video. As usual, because we are on Zoom, if you are not speaking, please unmute. And then we'd like to actually have people introduce ourselves. And so we are not an enormous group. We really would like to ask all of you to please interact, introduce yourselves, and contribute during this event. So Lydia is going to paste in the chat a Padlet link where you can put your name. And what we'd like to ask all of you to think about is, what is your vision for anticipatory action by 2050? And we're going to be exploring this in depth throughout the discussion today, and we would really like to hear from you. And we'll be asking the panelists to react to your visions. And so please put in there your ideas, be thoughtful, be provocative, and ask questions about, really, what are we looking to achieve as a community? And so then you are also encouraged to post questions and comments in the chat during the panel. You don't have to wait for the Q&A. If you post them in there, then we will hang on to them, organize them nicely, and during the Q&A, we'll make sure that the panelists address your questions. So please be active, take part in this meeting, and we'd really love to hear your thoughts as we go through this. So I am now pleased to introduce our distinguished co-chairs. First, Dr. Thomas Sennhausen, who's the Director for Humanitarian Assistance at the German Federal Foreign Office. And second, Ms. Pascale Mige, the Director of Disasters, Climate, and Crisis at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So over to Thomas to greet us with welcoming remarks to kick off the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear panelists especially, and dear Pascal, you raised it already. Who is doing the real work for this event is actually the Anticipatory Action Task Force and the Anticipation Hub who were organizing this. Our thanks to them, of course. And I want to continue with my introduction. Indeed, I'm the Humanitarian Director in the German Foreign Office for Humanitarian Assistance. But I've been that for 4 years, but not much longer. And throughout these 4 years, from the first day to the last, anticipatory action was somehow on my agenda. And I think I've been sitting on panels inside the ECOSOC Humanitarian segment for 4 years in a row. And I don't want to talk too much about where we stand, because we have a great panel who will discuss it, but only 2 points. I think after 4 years, and especially after the last 2 years, I think it's fair to say that the case has been made for anticipatory humanitarian action. I think it is now, frankly, proven that anticipatory humanitarian action is faster, it's more effective, it's more cost efficient, it is more the right thing to do because we can avoid unnecessary suffering from people. And we observe huge externalities in terms of better targeting, more participation. It's a great tool of localization and inclusive action. And the second point I want to make is we have not even started really tapping the potential. I think we here in the Foreign Office just assessing our own humanitarian budget. And I think we came to the conclusion that we can basically predict 20% of the humanitarian needs now with the data and technology available. But from out of that 20%, we at best finance 1%. So we are just at the beginning. And I think it is now the moment for us nationally, and I think internationally as well, to move beyond the pilots. It doesn't mean that we don't have to improve pilots, that we have to learn, reassess, expand the scope of prediction, but I think we really have to go to scale. And this is something that we really think is necessary now. It's a collective effort and it's possible. And I think the moment right is quite appropriate for doing that. I think we have created momentum in many ways, and I just want to remind you, those who follow it carefully have noticed it, of course. It has been an issue at the G7 summit, thanks to our British colleagues and friends. They highlighted the importance of anticipatory action, and we're currently preparing with OCHA and other like-minded an event on anticipatory action in September in New York. And hopefully we can really continue the discussion that we've started today with the panel of what is really necessary to go the next step. So this is where we stand, and I think this panel will really contribute to this discussion. I hope we will collectively really use the time and the conferences coming up to really go the next step and go beyond the pilot and make it a standard procedure in humanitarian assistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that is absolutely inspirational. We're talking about how we really need to scale up. We're not doing enough right now. Pascal, would you like to take the floor and give your welcoming remarks in light of this great ambition that Thomas has outlined for us?
Yeah, thank you, Erin, and I'm very pleased to co-chair this event with you. Thomas, you're an ally and champion of anticipatory action, and to welcome all of you joining us today. Well, every day, our Red Cross Red Crescent network hears about the stories of suffering caused by the humanitarian impacts of climate change and extreme weather events in communities across the world. And indeed, Erin, you mentioned it. In 2019, our Coast of Doing Nothing report indicated that by 2050, 200 million people every year could need humanitarian assistance because of the combination of climate-related disasters and the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. This is nearly double the estimated number of people needing assistance in 2019. And at the end of last year, OCHA predicted that a record 235 million people would need humanitarian assistance and protection this year, largely due to COVID-19. Well, our Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies are at the front lines of the pandemic, climate crisis, and other disasters, and they are seeing where systems lack capacity to cope with today's compound risks all the time, from cyclones to floods and droughts, coupled with food insecurity, conflict and violence, locust invasions, disease outbreaks, on top of the pandemic itself with its own health consequences and socioeconomic impacts. So scaling up climate action and strengthening risk-informed approaches to tackle compound risks and reduce humanitarian impacts should be a priority for all of us, and it's certainly a priority for us at the IFRC. Anticipatory action is a key solution, you mentioned it, Thomas, to reduce the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events. Since 2014, we have been pioneering anticipatory action by developing the forecast-based financing approach and building on the launch of the first fund for anticipatory action in 2018. IFRC and our membership have supported national societies to implement forecast-based financing in 30 countries. And now we see with the Anticipatory Action Task Force that there are about 60 countries that are being covered, which is great, but indeed not yet the scale that we can reach. And in partnership with the Anticipatory Action Task Force members, we are committed to scale up anticipatory action so that it reaches more people, covers more locations, and is applied to a wider range of hazards, as it is still very much linked to weather-related events. We are also proud to have launched the Anticipation Hub last year with the German Red Cross and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center through the support of the German Federal Foreign Office as a knowledge and exchange platform that provides scientists, practitioners, and policymakers access to evidence, tools, and expertise to strengthen our current action and better anticipate the future so that we are equipped for the scale up. We are also proudly hosting the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, which brings together an unprecedented range of governmental and non-governmental partners across the climate, development, and humanitarian fields, as we need all of us to be on board to create the change. Ambitious targets have been set by the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, which we should all contribute to. Last month, we launched the Climate and Environmental Charter for Humanitarian Organizations together with the ICRC, with the aim to unite humanitarian organizations in a collective ambition to do more together to tackle the climate and environmental crisis. Anticipatory action is one of the identified solutions in the Charter to step up our response to growing humanitarian needs and support those who are most at risk. So anticipatory action is very much at the center of many current processes and collaboration platforms. We need a system-wide shift, and this is what this event is about. But let's first hear about what the science is telling us, Erin, so that we can link science, policy, and practice, hence, and handing back to you to translate what it tells us about 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. I have to say that is quite sobering, your remarks about the numbers that we're seeing today of people who need humanitarian assistance during this incredibly, this crisis of a lifetime, right? COVID, and just contextualizing what we're looking at in terms of how climate-related disasters might affect that in the future. So thank you. It's exciting to hear about this, these commitments and the ambition that we have to move forward. So in terms of, yes, setting the scene, right? So the prompt here, right, the anchor that we've all been talking about here is the year 2050. So I'm happy to offer a few scene-setting comments about climate science and our expectations for 2050. And I will be brief, but here are a few thoughts. So 2050. The IPCC released a report a few years ago. It was a special report on 1.5 degrees. So I'm going to show a few figures from that report to give an overview of what we're expecting with climate change going forward in ways that are important for the humanitarian sector. So here are a number of bars of impacts and risks that the IPCC has laid out. And so you can see this gray area right here is where we are today. So we're already seeing impacts, these different colors across a number of different areas, and we're going to see these increase dramatically as the temperature raises. Can you see I don't know if you can see my pointer, but I am pointing to these things as I speak. So a number of these major areas of risk include vulnerable ecosystems like coral reefs, which are very dramatically going to be in distress with climate change. Then we also have a number of issues that are very important for our humanitarian work. Flooding, obviously, is one of these, coastal flooding and rainfall-induced flooding. And we're already seeing these impacts today. So as flood risk increases in many parts of the world, we need to start thinking about what we're going to do as the humanitarian sector to prepare for this risk. And it's not just climate that's changing. So we're talking right now, we're sitting here in 2021, and we're looking out to 2050. Humans are also changing as well. And so here's a map of places where people are, there are more people living in floodplains over time. So regardless of the climate, countries that you see here in yellow, orange, or red are seeing population growth in floodplains. So if you add this with the increasing flood risk, we're starting to see a big problem on the horizon. And this is what we need to be cognizant of as we make choices with development and humanitarian work going forward. Obviously, I'll also highlight crop yields. We see issues with, changing rainfall patterns, droughts, dry spells, all sorts of things that really can affect people's basic food production and food access and nutrition. I'll also highlight, of course, heat, which is a major issue that doesn't get a lot of attention in the humanitarian movement, or the humanitarian sector, excuse me. So heat waves are quiet. They are very, very deadly, but they don't often make front page news where you see lots of floodwaters and storms in the same way. But heat waves are extremely deadly, and they are increasing very rapidly in impact around the world. So here are a couple maps of, look, 1.5 degrees on the left, 2 degrees on the right, how we're going to see an increase in very hot days around the world. And this is quite dramatic and something that affects people everywhere. So what do all these events have in common? Storms, droughts, floods, fires. You heard Dr. Thomas explain that a lot of these things are predictable. We can predict these things before they happen. They shouldn't be taking us by surprise. We should be able to know if a storm is going to approach a coast before it happens. So the big question here is, can anticipatory action become a big part of our work? And can this become more than 1%, right? Can this become a meaningful aspect of what we do in the humanitarian sector to start to deal with this increasing frequency and severity of extreme events, and also increasing risk, right? Where are people living and why? So I'd like to pause and reflect again on the idea of 2050. Today is June 23rd, 2021. Let's just imagine for a second, June 23rd, 2050. What do you imagine? What will you be doing on June 23rd, 2050? Do you have any idea? And in fact, let's imagine 29 years ago. So 2050 is 29 years forward in the future. Let's go 29 years back. June 23rd, 1992. What were you doing? I can only imagine if I asked you on June 23rd, 1992, what you would be doing in 2021, you would not have said sitting on a Zoom call in the middle of a global pandemic. For sure, Zoom didn't exist, obviously. And so 2050 gives us scope to think big. It gives us scope to think about big changes, right? In 1992, the Cold War had just ended, the Iron Curtain had just fallen. In my country, in the United States, Bill Clinton was running for president. I pulled up the New York Times from 1992, and if you can see on the right, you might have to move your video a little bit, but there's this spy data article. Do you see that on the right? Where someone wrote an article suggesting that we use satellites and data that had been collected during the Cold War to study the climate and study weather, which is a fascinating event, right? It was something people realized we could be using to better understand the climate crisis that people were seeing on the horizon back in 1992. And I'm happy to say that we do use satellites to study weather now, 29 years later. This is common, and I can sit on my computer and access NASA satellites and European satellites and satellites from all over the world to get data about climate and weather, and we have improved our weather forecasting capabilities dramatically. So the graph that I put on the right shows how our error in forecasting cyclone tracks has decreased dramatically over time. We are so much better at understanding what will happen with a cyclone now than we were before. And so we've made a lot of progress, right? In 1992, flip phones hadn't been invented. So all this to say, in setting the scene, we are expecting major changes in our climate between now and 2050. And these are sobering changes and scary changes, frankly. But if you think about 2050, that's gives us space to have a big vision. And so obviously we don't want to stay in our old patterns of work and do the same thing over and over again between now and 2050. I mean, we won't, we know that. And so how can we make choices now, think about our big vision, and think about what is the role for anticipatory action and how do we get there? So I'd love to re-point people to the Padlet that Lydia has shared, and maybe Lydia could share it again. With this in mind, please think about a sentence or two to throw into this Padlet about vision. Think big. Think new systems. And I'm excited to open this conversation in a visionary way with all of our panelists that are going to come next to really help provoke this discussion. So I'd like to turn to our panelists then. Our first panelist is Ms. Leah Nicholson, who is a climate advisor for the permanent mission of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations. So Ms. Nicholson began her career with the Department of Environment in Antigua and Barbuda, and she's currently a climate advisor to the UN mission in New York. She has worked in West Africa, working in city climate planning. So again, trying to address this issue of vulnerability. Where are we living and why? How are we designing these cities? She held a master's degree in environmental management from Yale University and a bachelor's in international environmental policy. So we are very excited to have you with us today, Leah. Could you give us some perspective on what challenges and opportunities governments are facing? So they're looking at compounding risks here, right? Governments are not only dealing with one thing at a time, they're dealing with many things at a time. So what opportunities do you see for anticipatory action to help strengthen national risk management and cross-sectoral policies and plans? Go ahead, over to you.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks so much for the chance to be here today. And I think everyone working kind of on the ground has probably their own experience with what compounding risks looks like. I think in my case, it was really with Hurricane Irma, which hit Barbuda Category 5 in 2017. And about shortly after, another hurricane was approaching the island. And because the first hurricane had loosened up a lot of debris, it kind of became shrapnel. And so the government had to evacuate the entire island to Antigua. So kind of internal displacement. And so we're seeing, even like looking within climate, the kind of climate risk, these kind of cascading and compounding impacts that, although we know, so you pointed out, well, we know that the risk profile is increasing, but we don't understand how this is going to play out on the ground. And in that case, it was just, you know, another impact happened, and the consequences became such an order of magnitude more complicated and difficult. How do you return an entire island that has everything gone from it? And so it you know, the payout from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility was $7 million, which was great because it was immediate, but the recovery needs were over $200 million for the government. And so our current systems aren't able to keep pace with the impacts that we're seeing. And now we're looking at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. So, you know, it does feel like we're at a bit of a treadmill, and especially for small islands and kind of countries on the front lines, where it's not, the polluters pay is not at work, as in we're not causing the emissions, but we have disproportionately higher costs of trying to keep pace with it. And that's part of why we're in the situation that we're in today. So I think part of the challenges thinking about what to plan for is are we planning for a 1.5 degree world? Are we planning for a 2 degree world? Are we planning for a 3? We're currently headed towards a 3 degree world. And that gets much, much, much more expensive to do anticipatory action now. When we build a road, we need to look at kind of what it can cope with flooding wise. And that's a huge range. And there's financial decisions we have to make now to deal with that. So I think just kind of, looking ahead, the World Met Organization says we're going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, at least for a few months out of the year, within the next 5 years. So 2050 sounds far away, but the reality is that this is happening now and very short term. And I think one of the things we want to see in Antigua is more discussion around short term, and while thinking about the long term is really important. So the compounding risk, 2020 was the highest number of hurricanes in the Caribbean, which happened during a year that Antigua, for example, had no tourism income, which is 70% of the economy. So you quickly see, okay, we didn't get a major hit last year, but we have huge expenditures. What happens when climate continues to impact us? So I could talk a lot about the challenges, but you also asked about opportunities. So to talk a little bit about the opportunities, I think the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership launched in 2019 is helpful because it brings together different stakeholders. So we need compounding solutions if we're dealing with these complex compounding problems, and different people from different sectors to kind of be looking at this. So the goal of 1 billion is an ambitious goal, and I think we want to understand what does that change mean for those 1 billion people that the partnership is looking at, and making sure that the change we want is at a level that they can cope with 2 degrees or 3 degrees of impacts. So a positive trend that we're seeing is that all banks and others are stress testing now much more. So at least we're now doing the analysis to understand how we can cope with the impacts. There are still financial implications of stress testing that I think we're not making that cost benefit as much as we should. But we really just can't afford to cut corners anymore. And both at the household level, so when an individual homeowner is building their house or managing it, and also at the government. One thing I do want to mention is that on top of the challenges we're seeing, Antigua is now a high income country, so we no longer have access to concessional rates. So we're seeing its graduated development status. We have these huge magnitude of impacts. How are we going to deal with this? Like, it's really a question. Are we going to be financing hurricane recovery at market interest rates? Is that what homeowners is going to look at? So I think we need kind of systemic solutions that cut across all sectors if we really want to keep pace and keep focused on the opportunities for leaving no one behind in the climate transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, that is a tough perspective, absolutely, from a place that is dealing with, really the front lines, right, of what we're seeing on climate. So thank you. And I think those opportunities are good and very thought-provoking to help us think about how we're going to move forward, both in the near term and in the long term. So at this point, I'd like to move over to our next panelist. There will be a Q&A at the end, and we're going to bring up your visions and at the end. So I'd like to move through these people quite quickly. So thank you for keeping time. So our next panelist is Mr. Dominique Fujian, who is Director of the FAO Liaison Office to the UN in Geneva. Mr. Fujian has over 25 years of professional experience in various leadership positions with FAO. He was appointed Director of the Liaison Office with the UN in Geneva this year, following over 8 years directing the Emergency and Rehabilitation Division at FAO. So he has also led the FAO Corporate Strategic Program on Resilience, and therefore can draw on a variety of different background pieces to help push this agenda forward. So Dominique, can you tell us a little bit how, from all these different perspectives, how is FAO supporting anticipatory action, in particular supporting famine prevention, right? We've seen a resurgence of famine in recent years. And so how can this play a role in reducing the number of people that we expect to see facing food crises in the future? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erin. Very happy to be in this conversation, and I'm already tempted to respond to some of the comments that are in the chat, but I will refrain and I will wait for the Q&A part of the discussion. But indeed, since July 2020, FAO and WFP and hundreds of NGOs have been sounding the alarm, as you know, on the deterioration of the situation across the world in terms of acute food insecurity, acute hunger, as a result of course, multiple drivers, and of course, all of this made worse by the economic impact of COVID-19. In May, we released the last edition of the Global Report on Food Crisis, and we presented to the world that over 155 million people in 55 countries experienced what we call IPC 3+ level of acute food insecurity. So it means really a crisis or worse type of situation where people, have to cut on the quality, quantity of the meals, and really even dispose their assets to manage to cope with the situation. And this represented a 20 million increase compared to 2019. Unfortunately, it is becoming apparent, however, that the situation is continuing to deteriorate. The report presented the situation in 2020. Now, as you know, over the last couple of weeks, months, the situation is further deteriorated. And as of June, we have over 500,000 people actually facing starvation, IPC phase 5, in a number of countries. And I mean, unfortunately, we have no indication that the situation will improve. So it's clear that with such an exponential rise in hunger predictability, there is a gap between needs and resources. Predictably, sorry, there is a gap between needs and resources, and it is continuing to grow. A recent study that we have carried out in the context of the Global Network Against Food Crisis is showing that humanitarian funding to the food sector has increased over the last 3 years from $6.2 to $7.8 billion, and yet we still fall short of providing help, of course, to all those in need. It is clear that we cannot forever scale up humanitarian assistance to crises, and we need to urgently curb and reverse this unsustainable trend. What is, of course, also obvious, and what we know, is that in most cases where we see a rapid deterioration, it is because additional shocks are affecting already critically vulnerable people. People are on the verge, and I mean, because of conflict, because of economic shocks, and then, okay, they are being pushed off the cliff by an additional drought, floods, hurricane, whatever. And in many cases, it is clear that with the science and data that is available to us, we are able to foresee these shocks. For example, think of drought. There was mention of drought, even desert locust last year. And this is why anticipatory action is really at the core of what FAO and WFP are doing in their efforts to avert famine and food crisis. While in the meantime, of course, as I was saying, we are facing huge challenges in 2021, there is also a lot of hope, I would say. Now, and perhaps for the first time, there is a strong collective realization of the importance of preventing and anticipating food crises. But I think, and I can't agree more with Thomas in his introductory words, but we need to move beyond pilots. What if, I would say, if indeed there was a significant increase in the volume of anticipatory action funding coming from both humanitarian assistance and development and climate financing? If you think, for example, that FAO, we have demonstrated that $1 invested in anticipatory action leads to $7 in avoided loss only. So it means not counting avoided humanitarian assistance, not counting nutrition outcome, and not even counting the positive impact in terms of resilience building. So the maths are very clear in that and in favor of anticipatory action, and should definitely help us to speak to the parliaments, to the taxpayers and others. You also, I think, referred, to the high-level task force. You know that there was a high-level task force that was convened last March by the UN Secretary General to indeed mobilize resources, advocate for improved access to people, and share data in real time so that we can better prevent deterioration and act early and avoid famine to spread. There is also been the G7 Compact on Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Crisis. And there it is clear that it has the scaling up of anticipatory action among its priorities. And I would say that, and also this is because of the realization that we need to revolutionize our approach to food crisis and lessen growing humanitarian needs. We therefore very much hope that the over 8 billion in funding committed under the compact will be put forward. Both of these initiatives and the work of FAO and WFP clearly signal that we have entered a new era, one in which it is unacceptable to stand by and wait as emergency slowly unfold before us. Given the risk of famine facing many countries today, our collective responsibility to prevent such situation, I would say, has never been as important as it is today, and anticipatory action has a key role to play in that. But not everything can be done through anticipatory action, and this is perhaps for the following part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that is sobering. 500,000 people facing phase 5. I think that is just absolutely unbelievable. So thank you for your thoughts on really where we can go in the future. I'd love to just take a pause here and put up a poll for those who are participating and putting fantastic questions in the chat. And so maybe Anna, you could put the poll up so people can just very quickly add in their thoughts and reactions. There we go, excellent. So the question for you here today is, we've outlined a number of challenges. By 2050, what do you think we will still be grappling with? We've got 4 choices for you here: political will, funding, shifting mindsets, or the evidence base and knowledge on how to do anticipatory action well. Okay, this is great to see the real-time results coming in, and we'll close it in a minute or two. I'll let all of you reflect on this. But I think you've been hearing not only visions, but also realities of what we're seeing on the ground, right? Around the world, different hazards, different contexts. And so moving forward will be quite difficult. Okay, excellent. And you can now see the results. So the evidence base seems like something we believe we can tackle, but political will always be a continual challenge, seems to be the general consensus. Of course, funding and shifting mindsets are going to not go away as a challenge immediately. With that in mind, I'd love to introduce you to our next panelist, who is Ms. Fernanda Ayala. Since 2018, she's been working as a GIS specialist in the Ecuadorian Red Cross. So she has collaborated to develop and implement an early action plan for disasters to do anticipatory action in Ecuador. And so, Fernanda, welcome. And could you tell us a little bit about how your national society is advancing anticipatory action, right? How are you doing this, and how do platforms like the Anticipation Hub help to exchange knowledge and build up this community? Someone has actually asked in the chat about how we develop this community to work together. So over to you, and thanks for your thoughts.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this wonderful event. Well, the Ecuadorian Red Cross National Society has 2 early action plans. First, we have the EAP for extreme rainfall related to El Niño phenomenon. This is an approved EAP that is in the readiness phase and is ready to be activated in a case of El Niño event. Then we have our second EAP, the volcanic ashfall EAP, which is currently being updated and soon to be submitted for a revalidation after having been activated in September of the previous year. And well, this activation left the National Society some remarkable lessons learned. One of them is that we had to consider that the context in which the EAP is activated could be very dynamic. Talking from this experience, the activation was triggered during the public health emergency of COVID-19. So it was an emergency within an emergency. And this implies some action to be adapted on the go to meet our objective to assist and protect the livelihoods of 1,000 families from the communities that were more likely exposed to the ashfall event of the Sangay volcano. This is a real case scenario where we remark the importance of a complementary analysis that has to be done of the different possible scenarios that may emerge in future interventions. And our National Society is making a steady progress as we establish in our new structure an information management unit, which is responsible to analyze risk scenarios based on technical and scientific information as a solid basis to support the humanitarian interventions of the Ecuadorian Red Cross, and not only for anticipatory actions, but also through the phases of reduction, preparedness, response, and recovery, covering the whole cycle of risk management. And at the same time, we positionate the National Society as a provider of useful information, analytic information, meeting our auxiliary role in contribution to the decentralized national system of risk management of the country. And well, the participation and in our experience in dialogue platforms and being partner of the Anticipation Hub has facilitated this exchange of good practices and lessons learned, which can be mimetized by other national societies that avoid similar hazards, as well to establish links with key actors that represent scientific institutions. And in this way, we learn how both sides can work together, the humanitarians and scientifics, for the benefit of communities.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. It's yeah, intense to hear about your experience with a crisis within a crisis. And I hear you about how we need to be thinking about systems that can anticipate in an open-minded way, right, to understand what is the potential crisis and how do we deal with that. And it's good to hear about your experiences linking science, policy, and practice. That's really impressive with these dialogue platforms, for example. So thank you. And I'd like to then move us over to our next panelist, Mr. Martin Omoro, who is coming to us from South Sudan. He's the Program Quality and Strategy Manager at World Vision in South Sudan. Martin, we really appreciate your expertise from a complex context. And so it would be interesting to hear your thoughts. So a crisis within a crisis can happen in many ways. It doesn't need to be COVID-19. So how can anticipatory action approaches be applied in fragile contexts where you're dealing perhaps with climate, but also with many other risk factors and complexities? How are NGOs responding to these compounding challenges that we're looking at between now and 2050? So this is climate, this is conflict, displacement, etc. So over to you, and thanks for your remarks.
Well, thank you. Very interesting discussions that are going on. And in South Sudan currently, you know that almost close to 8 million people in need of assistance. But besides that, the needs, these needs keep changing. So World Vision's work under the Fragile Context Programming approach, of course being done in collaboration with CDA, tries to bridge the gap between linear programming, where linear means you're looking at fixed budgets, fixed outcomes, fixed activities, and then trying to blend this with context-led programming. The reality is that the contexts are always changing between survive, adapt, and thrive. Our communities are always oscillating in between there. So that calls out for models like the Fragile Context Programming approach, which is based on flexibility. And part of the action in how we're applying anticipatory action is through context analysis. monitoring and forecasting. We've done this in the pilots where we've had three-dimensional plans designed based for the different scenarios: survive, adapt, and thrive. And these designs basically predict that interventions will evolve and will also be adapted to the changing context. That's based on pre-defined triggers that we've identified, and some are flooding. Some of these areas we do have economic tendencies, we have displacement, and this happen year in, year out. But what's key here is, as we're doing all these changes and redesigns, we know that we should evolve from our focus, and resources and adjustments should remain aligned to the intended outcomes and results. Now, this cannot happen alone when you're working alone, and we continuously reflect and learn with the stakeholders, especially communities, because they understand and they experience the context and their way of life. So all actions around that should be able to have them and include them in this kind of reflection when planning for them, when looking at the context, even in the context monitoring and interpreting the information coming out from the context monitoring. Now, flexibility and decentralization in terms of our structures, in terms of our systems, in terms of our policies and decision-making is key, and this has worked for us. Now, I'll talk about the budgeting issue, because usually we have fixed budgets, but I mean, there's need for engagements over margins, like what can work, what's acceptable, what changes can you make within your budgets, and for it to work. We also have issues around data. It's always inadequate, but we face between, do we use the existing data that we have coming from our monitoring systems, from our context monitoring, from our partners, from the clusters, to be able to make decisions? And yes, we use that. It's not that clear, but again, working with the communities, we're able to anticipate and make decisions other than not act. Then we also don't work in the bubble, we work with partners and different UN agencies, we work with national partners, international NGOs, communities, faith-based organizations, and also the humanitarian architecture, that's the cluster, to be able to co-create solutions, plans, budgets, and funding in the event that some of these changes occur. But also, how do you access this funding in real time to be able to respond? And we move this further to engage certain donors and rolled out frameworks in Upper Nile, part of the country, on how this can work out. It's good that donors are beginning to come on board. Now, internally, of course, you need people to drive some of these processes. These systems don't run by themselves, so you need to have the right people with the right mindset and in the right places, and this allows us to be able to respond whenever the scenario changes quickly. And it's achieving a balance between highly skilled and multi-skilled staff, and this allows us to work in some of the places. And I would like to single out here the power of working with communities, building, trusting them, but also relying on them, communities and partners, to be able to plan, to monitor, and not just when the changes happen. We work with different communities across government structures at different levels, national to the lowest state level, while doing implementation. But lastly, as I talk about the pieces here, it's key. Integration is key in terms of these sectors. How do we add, for example, climate smart approaches into food security and livelihoods programming? And this has worked for us, creating convergence between the different sectors to be able to deliver a comprehensive assistance package that meets the needs of the communities. So as I conclude, I just want to summarize that anticipatory action is more accurate when we listen to the context and learn with communities, learn about yesterday, learn about today, in efforts to try and predict tomorrow. But also the precisions of anticipatory action are more closer to reality when we empower, when humanitarian actors empower the communities to plan, monitor, and decide on their needs based on changes in the context. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. This, I have to tell you, I wish I was taking notes, because, and this is recorded, but I think you had such a wealth of advice there. So, mixing staff who have depth with staff who have breadth, for example, and working with local contexts and delegating and decentralizing authority. I think all of these principles are going to be extremely important for us if we're going to be achieving this massive vision we have of anticipatory action in 2050. So thank you. Before we move on, I'll put up another poll quickly. There are a number of different aspects that we've talked about here, especially in the context of fragile contexts. And so this is a poll for all of you, but where do you think we need to be making sure we're very carefully putting attention? So some of the most critical aspect that you would highlight from this list, which reflects a lot of what Martin was speaking about. I actually don't think we've been able to capture all of the wonderful advice that you had, Martin. But question to the audience: what are your thoughts? Where do you think we need to be really putting attention on a critical aspect? Interesting to see the results come in. We'll give it 30 more seconds. Please vote, and then we'll reveal the results. Yeah, I have to tell you, this has been a very thoughtful and thought-provoking panel for me and hopefully for all of you. Why don't we go ahead and reveal these? Yeah, excellent, thank you. So what's interesting is there was not a huge winner. So obviously we need to be doing all sorts of best practices all the time. But I do have to say that the actual winner of integrated and adaptive approaches to programming does seem critical. What we're hearing from Ecuador, we're hearing from South Sudan, for example, is that places are complex, right? And you need to be adaptive, and you need to be able to work with people on the ground who know what's going on. And obviously context analysis, the next one was the runner-up. So with this in mind, I'd like to introduce our last panelist, certainly not least, Ms. Rhonda Mergani, who is the manager of the Somalia Humanitarian Fund, and she is the head of the Humanitarian Financing Unit at OCHA Somalia. So Rhonda comes to us with over 13 years of humanitarian experience, including development programming. She's worked extensively with OCHA managed pooled funds in Somalia, Turkey, Sudan, and South Sudan, and worked with the donor relations section in OCHA as well as WHO, supporting the health cluster and global fund programs, which is helpful to have a health perspective on all of this early warning, early action discussion. So Rhonda, over to you for some of to help finish setting the stage from all of our panelists. What lessons have you learned from implementing early action in Somalia? So this is a complex context, and there's a lot that has been done. And so what lessons could you offer to the rest of us to help adapt anticipatory action for future challenges and help better meet the needs of vulnerable and marginalized communities? We're really looking forward to your perspective. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erin, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Let me just quickly set the scene with regards to Somalia. It's one of the countries that has been massively impacted by climate change over the last decades. In the last 3 decades alone, Somalia has experienced or oscillated between 12 droughts and 19 floods, in addition to other shocks such as locust infestations, COVID-19 recently, and conflict, which is basically triple the amount of natural disasters that they experienced in the last 2 decades. So it shows how the speed with which the crises are starting to happen and shocks. And so we can actually rebrand the crisis in Somalia as a climate change driven crisis, where anticipatory action becomes all the more critical for it to be successful and to work. We basically launched the pilot through the OCHA managed pooled fund called the SURF, or the Central Emergency Response Fund. And we followed that with a second one this year. One was for the floods, one was for the droughts. And we'd like to share the experiences that we've learned from these 2 pilots. There's been volumes of learning, but I'll try to summarize this into 3 key basically areas of learning. First and foremost is the results. And we've seen that when we put the right activities delivered by the best positioned actors, we're actually able to show positive results and outcomes. And this is really important to make sure that we are actually able to reach and deliver to the people most in need. However, we need to ensure that there is pre-agreement on the triggers. And this is something that had been mentioned by Dr. Bergen, FAO, where we're looking at IPC, for example. And we know that there is always a risk that these triggers may or may not be met because these are forecasts. And so therefore, it is very important that we agree on them and we have the financing and the funding available for these triggers to then be taken action on. And also important is to have the right interventions that are going to be implemented to achieve these results. The second thing that we've seen at a very programmatic granular level is that when we're ready to implement and the funding is in place, that there is a trade-off between speed And we know that anticipatory action has a sweet spot in which you need to act at a particular point in time to be able to mitigate the crisis, and the engagement with the different partners at implementation level. And this trade-off basically means that to make sure that the critical response is delivered on time, we need to have seen clear communication. And that means there needs to be some sense of leadership because you have multiple partners. There needs to be commitment from the partners who are involved. There needs to be management of expectations, and there needs to be operational readiness by these partners who are saying they would like to implement because they need to hit the ground running. The last thing that basically I wanted to touch on is integration, and that is the integration of the frameworks itself. So basically, we're talking about the existing humanitarian processes that we have, or the country level plans where many of the humanitarian crises have, such as the humanitarian response plan or emergency and preparedness plans. Now we need to integrate the AA into these plans to make sure that we have predictability and sustainability, and so that we actually institutionalize it into our existing systems so that we're able to take action, but also to include it into other frameworks, such as the humanitarian development nexus, because it spans across all the different areas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fernanda. That is really thoughtful and provocative. I'd actually love to follow up on this with a last poll before we move to the Q&A session to really ask the audience their response here on in more of a provocative question. And so if Anna, you want to put up the poll really quickly. Exactly. Do you think we're going to be able to do it? So by 2050, will we be able to scale up anticipatory action in such a way that we will reach the most vulnerable communities? And obviously we'll unpack this a little bit in the Q&A about how we're going to do this. There have been some excellent questions in the chat. I'm going to direct them to different panelists. If you do have a question, please add it in the chat, and we'll move forward with the Q&A session. Yeah, I think we have most of the votes coming in. So why don't we release the poll and just show that this is an optimistic group. I imagine that those who say no have been keeping in mind a lot of the difficulties and challenges that we've heard about from around the world today. So it will be good to unpack a little bit how we can better address some of these challenges, as many of you have brought up in the chat with your questions. So let me start with a question on finance. So Leah and Martin, you can prepare yourselves for this one. You both mentioned finance. Maybe we could spotlight both of you and let you both take a quick stab at this question. But we're looking at, maintaining and sustaining anticipatory action, bringing it into the mainstream. And so one question that came from the chat was, well, first of all, how do we do that? But then the second question also was, how do we work with local funding streams? So national funding streams, local capacities, and how do we mobilize that to make sure that people are using this for early action? So over to you for just brief remarks, and then we'll move to more questions. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll kick off, Martin, and then over to you. So thanks a lot for the question. And I think people are already self-financing a lot of this work. So we did a gender survey in Antigua, and the results were really surprising that a household is actually spending like almost $2,000 per year on hurricane preparedness and other impacts and climate related stresses. And so it's not like there is already a lot of financing happening, and maybe what we need to understand is what are people already paying out of pocket, and then how do we merge the financing that is available and more needs to be available, so we haven't met the 100 billion goal, and provide a vertical flow. So more of that Climate Finance International needs to get down to the local level and complement. So I don't think we can look at institutionalizing ad hoc. We have to upfront and design it. For the Department of Environment in Antigua and Barbuda, we spent 1.5 to 2 years getting accredited to the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. And now we have tens of millions of dollars approved, and we're providing loans directly to households. So we've basically done a vertical flow of climate finance, and they're doing it at 2-3%, and it's through a revolving fund. So we're able to get access to more people. So I think local level leadership, working with existing financial flows, because a lot of money is already dealing with this locally, and scaling up. As you know, I really support that point that we're beyond this stage of pilots, and we need to think about this at scale, and supporting the local leadership from the beginning. Thanks.
Yeah, that is wow, that is inspirational. Martin, would you like to complement this with any other ideas?
It's an interesting question here, and to me, coming from my perspective from a side of monitoring, I think the first thing before financing is we need to produce evidence around this. If there's no evidence, then the funding is not going to come. Everybody's looking out for evidence before they can put in their funding. That's the first thing. The second looks around building partnerships, and I'm talking about the private sector. When it comes to humanitarian assistance and interventions, they're kind of left steps back. It's time to reach out to the private sector, engage with them, have conversations with them to be able to scale up financing. And I'll go to the routine sources of financing. For example, in South Sudan, we do have the South Sudan Humanitarian Fund, which is good enough to support whenever anticipatory action is needed. We've seen that when they've come through the different floods responses, for example, but more funding needs to get inside there to be able to meet the dates.
Yeah, absolutely. And point taken about evidence. I think that's absolutely critical. I'd love to move, thank you both for taking that question. I'd love to actually, if you could spotlight Fernanda, and we'll move the next question to her. This is from Mark Sheffer, who's asking about how we can generate consensus, right? In order to be able to do anticipatory action, we need a lot of different groups to work together, right? So this is government, this is different humanitarian actors, development actors, need to take collective action. So Fernanda, could you you mentioned the dialogue platforms, you mentioned collaboration with government. Could you just maybe explore this question in a minute or two? Do you have thoughts on how we could generate such consensus of the vision and collaboration?
Well, thanks for the question. I believe that something important here is when we are developing, for example, the EAPs for anticipatory actions, we should involve every organization that is going to be on field in a case this is activated or is triggered. Why I say this is because we are not alone in the field. When something emerges, the Red Cross is not the only one that responds. There are a lot of institutions that are ready to respond in a case of in an emergency. So it should be from the beginning. From the beginning, we are developing all the planification. We should put this vision of anticipatory actions in the whole levels. And something important here is to take this chip, we say, out of mind, that we not only have to respond, but we have to prepare communities for emergency situations.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate the point about working from the beginning, right? That you can't just bring people in later once you have a plan. That's absolutely a good pointer for all of us. Thank you, Fernanda. I'd love to move a different question over to Rhonda. So Rhonda, you have quite a lot of expertise in pooled funds, different funding mechanisms. OCHA coordinates across a lot of agencies. However, so Agnes Doer pointed out in the chat that there can be competition over resources between anticipation and response, for example, preparing versus responding. And then, of course, we need to be cognizant of our relationship with development, right? So could there be some concern that humanitarians start to bear the burden of limiting crisis, but in fact, the risk is reflecting a failure of development action as well? So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, about competition, about just coordination with the development sector as well. So thanks.
Thank you very much. And it's a really good question. And I think it is the conundrum of basically anticipatory action versus humanitarian response, because The reality is that if we look across the world, all the humanitarian crises are underfunded. So we have a current emergency that needs a response now, and we need funding for that. And then we have basically anticipatory, where we're expecting something. We have triggers, we have indicators that say something is going to happen, and we need funding for that. So where do you direct the resources? There is going to be a competition. There is no doubt about that. The idea is, I think we need to institutionalize it in that we are basically looking at certain triggers and saying, okay, even though there is a risk and even though resources may need to be diverted or specifically allocated for that, then we need to do it. With regards to development, I wouldn't say there's a competition, because in general, development resources and funding is not really linked to the humanitarian one, and they're not really influenced by the two. However, what we need to have is the synergy and that nexus that we keep talking about, but we still fail to completely get right. And that basically requires a lot more of the government will. If we have a flood that's coming, we need to get the banks ready. And that's basically preparedness. You can put it in development, you can put it in early action. It needs to be all three coming in so that you do make progress over the years. And before you do that, we're going to continue to have this competition of resources. And that is one of the dilemmas that we face.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's no sugarcoating that we need to put some effort into this, and that this nexus is incredibly, incredibly important. So thank you for your comments on that. I'd love to turn it over now to Dominique to comment a little bit. We have had a couple questions on drought and food security. And so someone actually wrote in the chat that drought will be another pandemic for many people if we're not moving forward in this area. So their question was, how we can coordinate and learn from anticipation actions to better address drought risk. And Salamane to Buba pointed out current famine risk can be used to understand lessons for the future. And so I guess one question for you then, Dominique, is how FAO and WFP and other food-focused agencies are learning lessons, and what lessons you would share with us to help avoid cyclic food crises in the future. Over to you.
Oh, quite a big question, but thank you very much. And indeed, I think there was a comment in the chat that was put by Anwarul, was saying that he had a vision that by 2050, anticipatory action can provide support to reduce the suffering from drought affected people. And he was referring to the drought. And it's clear that what we see, I mean, for example, since Sendai, we've been producing regular report on the impact on natural disasters on food security in the agriculture sector, and we see that of course the intensity, frequency, and of drought is becoming more and more, and we see that the agriculture sector is of course absorbing up to 80% of the total cost of the impact of drought, and is therefore having a devastating impact on food security. And in this context, it is clear that anticipatory action has a key role to play. And again, I think we have amply demonstrated that that by acting early, we can definitely mitigate the impact and preserve the livelihoods of people and avoid people prevent them from falling into acute food insecurity. This said, I think what I would like to say here is that indeed anticipatory action is critical, but it's, I think, a critical part of a larger toolbox. And as part of that, I think we should not. I think it wouldn't be realistic to have sort of over expectation in what anticipatory action can achieve. It's critical, but I would say not sufficient, and there is a lot that needs to be undertaken, for example, in terms of disaster risk reduction, in terms of climate change adaptation, to really make sure that we have the right type of investments that are made primarily by development and by climate financing, to indeed make sure that the people are in anticipation, I would say, not so exposed to that sort of disaster, with then, of course, the early warning for early action, the anticipatory action still coming in to address, I would say, the remaining part, the residual risk that would still be there. So I think really it's a call to say, yes, critical as one tool on which we need to work to invest further, but there is also a need to invest on longer term resilience, on climate change adaptation, on disaster risk reduction, and that sort of approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, bringing all these pieces of the puzzle together. Absolutely. So thank you for those comments. I'd love to invite all of the panelists up because we'd like to start our wrap up. And so if I can invite all the panelists to the screen, essentially, someone will spotlight you. Then what we'd like to do is come back to this idea of visioning. So in light of what all of you have talked about, in light of the questions and your thoughtful responses, what do we see here as our vision between now and 2050? And so I'd love to just bring you to, I've been keeping an eye on the visions that have been populated in the Padlet. And what's interesting is that we've seen there a lot of common themes, right? So accountability to affected populations, that anticipatory action becomes a key part of the humanitarian toolkit, that it is embedded in local policies, that race, gender, disability, and inequality are all addressed, right? That we see transitions of decision-making power to grassroots organizations, and that development investments are risk-informed, right? I think these all form part of this collective vision that we are working towards. So to close the panel, I'd like to ask each of you, each of the panelists, for just 1 minute or so, just a couple sentences, to just give us a quick final thought on what the road ahead looks like for anticipatory action and scaling of anticipatory action, keeping in mind our big vision. So let me see. I don't know who would like to go first. Fernanda, would you mind to go first because you were last? We'll maybe go backwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you. In short, we've done the pilots and we've heard everybody say that, it's time to move beyond the pilots. But what we've seen is translating that into action requires a lot of thoughtfulness and intention and really difficult decisions. So I would say in short that anticipatory action really could be the future of humanitarian response, but we have to get it right.
Excellent, thank you. And Martin, would you go next?
So with community participating and technology available, it's time to bridge the two, communities and technologies. And I see technology and artificial intelligence as a key driver to achieve anticipatory action in the future.
Fantastic. Wow, everyone is very concise. Technology, I think that's something we haven't spoken enough about today. Thank you for bringing that up. Fernanda, over to you.
Well, I think anticipatory action should be institutionalized as part of risk management at all levels, starting from the communities, as they are the first to respond in an emergency. And one way to do this is to generate a dynamic and didactic, accessible material to contribute in the decision making and implant this capacity in a long term.
Excellent. Thank you. Dominique, over to you.
Well, yes, thank you. I think, well, in view of the food security situation that we are experiencing today, it's clear that 2021, 2022 will be crucial years in which we will be put to test whether we are able to indeed anticipate further deterioration, and we cannot fail in this task. First, this is the first point. I mean, we didn't talk much about COVID, but COVID-19 was indeed a strong reminder that we need to move beyond a single shock approach, and that we need to look at the variety of shocks, and this is critical. And then the third point is that, of course, as FAO and WFP, we are committed and we have a role to play, an opportunity to make anticipatory action an integral part of food security programming. we will do that. We are working also with OCHA to basically develop an interagency anticipatory action framework with hopefully prepositioned funding in some of the natural hazard and conflict-prone regions. So this is for us very important, and this is definitely a corporate commitment, and I can tell you that very high on the list of our Director General, Chidongi. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're looking forward to hearing more about that in the future. Leah, would you like to finish us off?
Yeah, so I think for anything climate related, the most anticipatory action we can take is to stop emitting right now as soon as possible. And that is, you know, our call number one in everything we should do. We need to look at bringing down emissions very quickly. And this transformational, so anticipatory action is important. We need prevention, we need anticipatory, and we still need recovery. So it's not an either or, it's really shifting towards transformation from the bottom up. And I think there's that saying that we overestimate what we can do in 2 to 5 years, and we underestimate the change that will happen in 10 years. And so I think by 2050, we're going to see massive amounts of change. And in the meantime, we just need to keep putting full work plans ahead for the next 2 to 5 years to get things done. Thank you.
Well, that's a beautiful reflection, and made me think about my New York Times search. Absolutely, I think that is very true, and a good push for all of us to think about short term and how that fits in with the long term. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for your amazing reflections as a panel and your pushes for us as a community for how we move forward. I'm going to then now turn it over to our two co-conveners who are going to give closing remarks. And so I'd love to start then with Dr. Thomas Eisen, the Director for Humanitarian Assistance at the German Federal Foreign Office, to give about maybe 4 minutes of closing remarks to wrap us up today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. I'm not even sure I need 4 minutes, but first of all, many thanks to the panel. I've been in many panels in these 4 years, but the one I always like best are the ones on anticipatory financing and anticipatory approaches, because there seems to be change every time. And I mean, frankly, I'm not a climate specialist, but I don't think there's a silver bullet for climate change. There's just none. And certainly humanitarian anticipatory action is definitely not a silver bullet to fight climate change. But it's something that we don't need a vision to put that into action. I think it is already there. And as I said in the beginning, now it's really time to change gears. And the reasons have been lined out by many from the beginning. And so I don't want to repeat them. Just one remark on a specific case of Madagascar, which we had recently in a parliamentary inquiry, where they asked us, what did you do in the context of Madagascar in an anticipatory way? And we researched that, and we found out that actually everything was predicted correctly. The food insecurity, the climatic impacts, everything was there. There were even models. There were pilots working, but way too small, too limited, etc. So I think there's simply no reason that we stay at this point of time at this level of implementation. Dominique made that very clear. So what can we do? The impact on the ground, we don't need that. I think we heard it from Fernanda, we heard it from Martin, that I think our local partners on the ground are able to do it. It is just we have to change the way we're interacting. And now I say the donors and the big humanitarian actors. And I think from henceforth, Germany, we will continue to discuss it with our partners in a different way. So far, we ask our partners, are you also doing anticipatory humanitarian action? I think from now on, we will ask them, why don't you do it in an anticipatory way? I think, and we will ask them the question that Randa asked them, how is your interaction on anticipatory approaches in a particular country setting? Do you create the leadership to get these triggers right, these models right? And I think this is something that we will push very hard in the next few months. And I'm not really worried about the funding. I think Somalia is a very good case. And when we have these climatic impacts, we fund it anyway. But if we do it in an anticipatory way, it will be more meaningful. It will be probably even cheaper. So I think this is a kind of fallacy that if we pre-position money for anticipatory action, that we would divert it for something else. Because we will finance the next humanitarian disaster, a drought, a flood, a cholera epidemic. So I'm very confident that we can make that case, and we will make it with a lot of other partners very soon. The second one, I think, where there is a magic bullet in play, it's about data. Data and predictions. I think it changes the dynamic towards risk-informed discussions. And many of the panelists made it very clear. The prediction you can use in many ways. You can use it for anticipated humanitarian action, but you can also use it for climate adaptation. You can streamline development action towards, creating resilience on the ground, build capacity. So I think on that basis of predictive models, I think it will really change the whole dynamics of how we interact about what is at stake and how we can address risk. And that is really, for me, the core and the key driver of the future nexus. It is not about comparing notes about projects, but it is discussing collectively based on facts and data what to do together. And that's why I'm very optimistic that this approach will be the driver for the system, not only humanitarian, but also development and climate adaptation. And I leave that with a very optimistic note that I think we're on the right track. And Erin, thank you very much for guiding us.
Yeah, no, thank you for all of your reflections to everyone. I think those are really important points. Of course, the importance of data, but then also, yes, the importance of coordination and creating accountability, right? So that if a disaster happens, humanitarians don't just say, okay, now we go, but someone says, hello, where were you, right? That we have this expectation for ourselves to act before a disaster. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Pascal for another set of closing remarks, about 4 minutes. Again, Pascal is the Director of Disasters, Climate and Crisis at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So Pascal, thank you for your final reflections here today.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, for the great moderation, and also all the panelists for sharing your experiences, expertise, and insights. It's always fascinating. I agree with Thomas. Those are my favorite panels, because every time you learn something different, a different perspective, but also seeing how many more voices are coming to this discussion on anticipatory action. I mean, I'm just looking 5 years back, it was still a small circle of experts who were the believers, and now this is still, this is really something that is part of our work as humanitarians, already in the spirit, and indeed maybe not yet into the practice everywhere. But it is clear that the experience of having to respond so rapidly to the COVID-19 crisis must serve as a wake-up call to accelerate action, to also deal with the impacts of climate change, which are already hitting vulnerable communities so hard. And anticipatory action is really increasingly recognized as being a key component of this acceleration. And I think we heard a lot this notion of this has to be anchored at local level. We heard it from Fernanda, we heard it from Martin. This has to be in the community. So it's not just about jumping in and providing assistance, as we have maybe been doing so much from the humanitarian sector, but embarking in a process so that the communities can be part of it and can lead their own anticipatory action with their humanitarian actors and authorities on ground. Thomas, I think we can confidently say that we are no longer just at a pilot phase. The numbers are still maybe not that big, also in terms of number of people that are currently covered by formalized plans for anticipatory action with attached financing. But we have, I think, very sound building blocks in place everywhere in terms of geographies, not yet in every country, but in all the different continents and regions. Growth is happening, and there is a momentum and a rhythm and an interest, which puts me in a very positive mood on that. So indeed, I mean, we tend maybe to underestimate or overestimate what we can do within a certain period of time, but just looking 5 years back, I think that we see great great progress. What is also coming clear from the discussion today is that while we have different focuses or mandates, we hear from Dominique, of course, you know, the food insecurity is one big thing, but we have different actors. I mean, Fernanda was talking about, you know, ashfall, which comes with winds. And this is not immediately something that you might be talking about as a humanitarian problem for communities. It's not something very familiar to all of us. Erin, you were mentioning heat waves. You know, there are very many different aspects to this. But what we can see with these different voices is that it's more, better, and together as the only approach that we should strive for. We must better connect stakeholders and strengthen the synergies to achieve our joint ambition to scale up anticipatory action in the face of climate, pandemic, compounding risk. And if I can maybe end on that, Erin, maybe to call on individuals and organizations present here today to join forces with us and others, the Anticipatory Action Task Force, the Anticipation Hub, and others involved in those key initiatives, to join the Anticipation Hub, to join the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, where you can have those great conversations and all the learning at disposal and the support in terms of understanding how to handle the process or how to handle the science and bring those pieces together. And also invite you to sign the Climate and Environmental Charter for Humanitarian Organizations if you have not done so already, so that we really demonstrate that we come together and that we commit to implement in our own actions together and in partnership a huge scale up of anticipatory action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for your optimism and reflecting the optimism, I believe, of the group we have here today. And yes, more, better, together. So please, just directing everyone to the chat, Lydia has been putting in a number of resources. There are a number of ways in which you can become involved. Please do join. Let's indeed work on this together as a community. So on behalf of the co-organizers, I'd like to again thank you to everyone who joined this virtual event, and a huge thank you to our distinguished panelists. This was just a fantastic discussion that I found eye-opening, and hopefully all of you did here today. So looking forward to more, better, and together for the next, what did I say, 29 years to 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.